The rain poured relentlessly, turning the dirt beneath him into cold, sticky mud. His fur, once a proud coat of black and tan, was now dull and matted. His ribs pressed against his skin, hunger gnawing at him like a relentless enemy. The chain around his neck was rusted, heavy, far too short for a dog who had once roamed the world freely. He had served with honor. He had saved lives. And now, he was nothing more than a forgotten relic of war. Max, a name once spoken with pride by the soldiers he had protected, lay curled in the corner of a barren backyard, shivering against the bitter wind. He no longer dreamed of the missions, of the endless deserts and dense jungles he had once navigated. Because the hardest battle of all was the one he faced now, abandonment. For 10 years, Max had been more than just a military dog. He had been a soldier, a partner, a guardian. Trained from the time he was just a pup, he had mastered every command, every skill, every expectation placed upon him. He had sniffed out explosives buried beneath the sand, had tracked enemies through the cover of darkness, had taken down threats before they could harm his fellow soldiers. And he had saved lives, more than anyone could count. To his handler, Sergeant James Carter, Max had been more than a canine. He had been family. But war is cruel. It takes as much as it gives, and sometimes it gives nothing at all. When Carter was injured on their final deployment, he was forced to retire. Max, too, was deemed unfit for further service. But instead of returning home with his handler, bureaucracy intervened. Max was reassigned to a different state, a different base, a different world. And then, like so many retired service dogs, he disappeared into the system until he was forgotten. No one knew exactly how it happened. Maybe he was shuffled from one temporary caretaker to another, slipping further and further through the cracks. Maybe someone had taken him in, only to grow tired of the responsibility. Or maybe, most heartbreakingly of all, he had been discarded like an old piece of equipment, left to rot in an overgrown yard with no one to remember who he was or what he had done. Max stopped barking after a while. No one came when he did. Days turned into months, months into years. The strong, proud soldier who had once sprinted across war zones with unwavering purpose now barely moved. His muscles had weakened. His vision had started to fade. But the worst part, the part that hurt more than the cold, more than the hunger, more than the ache in his bones, was the waiting, the hope, the endless, gnawing hope that someone, his handler, his team, anyone, would remember him. But no one came, until one day, when a familiar voice shattered the silence. And everything changed. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the rusted chain that bound Max to the splintered wooden post. The storm was coming, dark clouds rolling in fast, carrying the scent of rain and something else, something unfamiliar. Max lifted his head weakly, ears twitching. Even after all these years, his instincts remained sharp. His body might have been frail, his strength faded, but his senses, his duty, never left him. There was a sound beyond the fence, a presence. Someone was there. His hackles rose slightly, though he didn't have the energy to growl. Instead, he remained still, listening, waiting. He had done this 1,000 times before, lying in the dirt, in the shadows, ears trained on the enemy's movements, waiting for the moment to strike. But this was different. This wasn't war, or at least, not the kind of war he had known. A low voice murmured on the other side of the fence. A man's voice. Then a second. Younger. Are you sure no one's home? Yeah. Place is abandoned. But I saw the old man come by a few days ago. Probably got cash or meds inside. Max's ears twitched. Burglars. The realization hit him slowly. Once he would have lunged. Once he would have taken him down before they even made it through the door. But he was no longer the powerful K9 who had charged into enemy territory without hesitation. He was tired, weak, and chained. He could do nothing but listen as the sound of metal scraping against metal filled the air. The burglars were breaking in. And for the first time in his life, Max felt useless. But then, something changed. As the wind shifted, a new scent hit his nose, cutting through the decay of the yard, the rust, and the stench of neglect. Familiar. So familiar it sent a jolt of energy through his weakened frame. It was faint, buried beneath the rain, the filth, and time itself. But it was there. Him. Max's heart pounded as his head lifted fully for the first time in days. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Yet the scent, undeniable, unforgettable, brought back memories so vivid they almost hurt. Sand. Sunday gunfire. A firm grip on his harness. A steady voice whispering, "Stay close, buddy." Sergeant James Carter. Max's handler. And he was here. A car door slammed in the distance, followed by hurried footsteps. "Hey!" A voice shouted, sharp and commanding, sending the burglars into a frenzy. "What the hell are you doing?" Then chaos. The burglars bolted. There was a crash, a window shattering, and the sound of bodies scrambling over the fence. Then silence. Max remained frozen. Then footsteps. Slower. Approaching. He knew those footsteps. And then a shadow appeared in front of him. A man, soaked from the rain, breathless from running, staring at him as if he had just seen a ghost. "Max!" The voice broke. And Max, the forgotten soldier, the discarded hero, felt something deep inside him reignite. He lifted his head fully, ears perked, tail twitching just slightly. The man dropped to his knees, staring into his eyes, searching. "Oh God," Carter whispered. "Max, what did they do to you?" Max wanted to move, to jump into the arms of the man he had thought was gone forever. But his body betrayed him. He was too weak. Still, he leaned forward, pressing his nose against Carter's trembling hand. Recognition. Relief. Home. Carter let out a sharp breath, his hands shaking as they moved to Max's face, cradling it with the gentleness of someone who had lost something precious, only to find it again, against all odds. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he choked out. I didn't know. Max didn't blame him, because now, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone anymore. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind the scent of damp earth and rusted metal. Max lay in the back seat of Carter's truck, wrapped in an old military blanket, his breathing shallow but steady. The warmth of the fabric, the familiar scent of his handler, and the hum of the engine beneath him felt like echoes of a life long gone. Carter drove in silence, his grip tight on the wheel, his knuckles white. His mind raced with questions, anger simmering just beneath the surface. How had this happened? How had Max, his partner, his brother in arms, ended up chained and abandoned like a piece of trash? Carter had trusted the system. He had been told Max would be rehomed, cared for, honored in retirement as he deserved. But the scars on Max's body, the weight of his fragile frame, told a different story. And Carter needed answers. By the time they reached Carter's home, Max had drifted into an exhausted sleep. The warm glow of the porch light illuminated the deep lines of Carter's face as he gently lifted Max out of the truck, careful not to jostle him. Inside, he set up a soft bed near the fireplace, laying Max down before stepping back. The dog barely stirred. A lump formed in Carter's throat as he crouched beside him, running a hand over his bony shoulders. "You're home now, buddy," he whispered. "I swear, I'm going to make this right." That night, Carter barely slept. Instead, he scoured through old military contacts, sending messages, making calls. He dug through archives, searching for Max's records, where he had been sent after retirement, who had been responsible for him. But what he found made his blood run cold. Max's file was missing. No record of adoption, no medical history, no discharge paperwork, nothing. It was as if he had simply disappeared. Carter sat back in his chair, his jaw tightening. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had erased Max's history on purpose. Max whimpered in his sleep, his paws twitching against the blankets. Carter glanced over from his desk, heart clenching at the sight. For years, Max had been fearless, unshakable. Now he thrashed in his dreams, whimpering softly, lost in something Carter couldn't see. He moved closer, crouching beside him. "Hey, buddy. It's okay. You're safe." Max stirred but didn't wake. Then Carter saw it. Max's paws were moving in a slow, repetitive pattern. Digging. Carter frowned, watching carefully. Max's claws flexed against the blanket, his head tilting slightly, as if following a scent. It was the same movement over and over again. Carter's gut twisted. It was a signal, a warning. Max wasn't just dreaming. He was remembering something. Something buried. The next morning, Carter followed Max outside, watching closely as the old dog limped across the yard. His movements were slow, stiff, but there was something intentional about them. Then he stopped, right in the middle of Carter's backyard, and started digging. Carter's heart pounded. He grabbed a shovel and helped, the wet earth giving way beneath his hands. Then, the metal clink. Something was buried here. Carter pulled out a small, rusted box, wiping away the dirt. His fingers trembled as he pried it open. Inside was a dog tag, Max's dog tag, and beneath it, a single scrap of paper. A name, Colonel Richard Vaughn. Carter's blood turned to ice. He knew that name. A high-ranking officer, one who had been responsible for overseeing the retirement of military K-9s. A man rumored to have been involved in something darker. Something illegal. Carter clenched his fists. Max had led him here for a reason. This wasn't just about neglect. This was something bigger. And Carter was going to find out the truth, no matter what it took. Carter sat in the dim glow of his living room, the rusted dog tag resting in his palm. Max lay beside him, his breath slow but steady, his body too weak to do more than lift his head. But his eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, watched Carter as if urging him forward. The name on the scrap of paper burned in Carter's mind. Colonel Richard Vaughn. Max hadn't led him to this by accident. Someone had erased his records, buried the truth. But Max remembered, and Carter wasn't about to let it go. The next morning, Carter made a call to an old military friend, someone still on active duty with access to classified files. "I need everything you can find on Colonel Vaughn," Carter said, "and the K-9 retirement program." His friend hesitated. "Carter, what are you into? Just find it." Hours later, Carter's phone buzzed with a message. A single file was attached. He opened it and felt his stomach drop. Vaughn had been part of a covert operation handling retired K-9s. But instead of rehoming them, he had been selling them. War dogs, sold to the highest bidder. Drug cartels, private security firms, underground fighting rings. Many of the dogs had vanished without a trace. Max had been one of them. Carter gritted his teeth, rage curling in his chest like a storm. Max was never meant to have a home. He had been thrown away, discarded when he was too weak to serve. Carter gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white as he drove toward Vaughn's last known address. The house was a sleek, expensive estate, too polished for a man who had built his wealth off the suffering of his own soldiers. Carter stepped onto the porch and pounded on the door. Silence. Then, the door cracked open. A man in his 60s, dressed in a pressed shirt, eyed Carter warily. "I was wondering when someone would come knocking." Carter's jaw tightened. "You know who I am?" Vaughn smirked. "Of course. Sergeant Carter. You and your dog were quite the duo." He leaned against the doorway. "Tell me, how is old Max?" Something inside Carter snapped. He lunged forward, grabbing Vaughn by the collar, slamming him against the doorframe. "You left him to die," Carter growled, his voice low and dangerous. Vaughn didn't even flinch. "I did what I had to. The government doesn't fund retirement homes for dogs, Carter. They cut them loose, and You sold them," Carter snarled. "Like property." Vaughn chuckled darkly. "Like weapons. And weapons that don't fire anymore? They get discarded." Carter's fists trembled, his vision red. He wanted to throw a punch, wanted to make Vaughn feel what he had done. But then, a sound, a low, rumbling growl. Carter turned. Max had dragged himself out of the truck. His legs were weak, his body frail, but his eyes burned with something Carter hadn't seen in years. Determination. Max took one step forward, then another. Vaughn's smirk faltered. "I wouldn't," he said, taking a step back. "He's old, weak. One wrong move, and..." Max lunged, not with the force of a young war dog, but with the weight of every wound, every betrayal, every year of suffering. His teeth snapped inches from Vaughn's wrist, his body pushing forward with sheer will. Vaughn stumbled back, fear flashing across his face. Carter pulled Max away, holding him close, his own heart hammering in his chest. Max had used the last of his strength to stand against the man who had thrown him away. And Carter wasn't about to let that go to waste. By the time the police arrived, Carter had already sent the files to every military contact, journalist, and law enforcement officer he knew. Vaughn was arrested on federal charges. The truth came out: every dog he had sold, every crime he had covered up. And Max? Max became the face of justice. The forgotten war dog who had been left to rot, only to rise again. But some battles take more than courage to win, and some wounds don't heal. 2 weeks later, Max lay on a soft bed near the window of Carter's home. The sun was setting, bathing the room in gold. His breathing was slower now, more labored. Carter sat beside him, running a hand through his fur. "You did good, buddy," he whispered. "You did so good." Max let out a slow breath, his eyes soft, trusting. Carter swallowed the lump in his throat. He had spent years thinking he had lost Max, and now he wasn't ready to lose him again. But Max had fought his last battle, and this time he could rest. As the final light of the sun faded, Max let out one last sigh. And then he was gone. But he hadn't died forgotten. He had died home. The house felt different without Max. The space near the fireplace, where he had spent his final days, remained untouched. His collar sat on the mantel, next to a framed photo of their younger days. Carter in his uniform, kneeling beside a strong, proud Max, both of them ready for whatever the world would throw their way. But now, the house was silent. And yet, Carter didn't feel alone. Max had been more than a dog, more than a soldier. He had been family. He had endured war, saved lives, and faced death more times than any living creature should. But the greatest battle he had fought wasn't on a battlefield. It was the one he faced when the world turned its back on him. And in the end, despite everything, Max had won, because he hadn't been forgotten. The story of Max's suffering and his bravery spread far and wide. News stations covered the scandal of Colonel Vaughn's corrupt operation. Social media lit up with outrage, with people demanding justice for every military K-9 that had been discarded, just like Max. But more importantly, change followed. The military launched an investigation into how retired K-9s were handled, ensuring no more war dogs would slip through the cracks. Legislation was proposed to provide funding for retired service animals, ensuring they received the medical care, shelter, and dignity they deserved. And Max's name became a symbol of that fight. Carter was asked to speak at ceremonies honoring military dogs. At each one, he told Max's story, not just of his heroism in war, but of his resilience in the face of betrayal. "War dogs don't just serve us," Carter told the crowd at one event, his voice thick with emotion. "They save us, over and over again. And when their service is done, when they've given us everything they have, it's our duty to protect them, just like they protected us." The audience rose to their feet, applauding. And Carter knew Max's fight hadn't been in vain. Months passed, but Carter still felt Max's presence. Every time the wind rustled through the trees, every time he glanced at the empty spot by the fireplace. But it wasn't sadness anymore. It was gratitude. Max had found his way home in the end. He had taken his final breath in the arms of the person who loved him most. And that was more than many forgotten war dogs ever got. One day, Carter visited the military cemetery where fallen K-9s were honored. He stood before a newly placed plaque, engraved with Max's name, his service years, and a single inscription: "Faithful to the end, never forgotten." Carter exhaled deeply, his fingers brushing over the metal. Then he whispered, "You did good, buddy." The wind stirred, carrying his words into the open sky. And for the first time in a long time, Carter smiled. Because heroes like Max never truly die. They live on, in every soldier they saved, in every life they touched, and in the hearts of those who will never forget them.